Hello and welcome to Indus Afghan Special. I'm Jawad Tehami.
I am Zunaira Azhar.
The situation in Afghanistan is deteriorating as the Taliban are rapidly advancing and capturing the provincial capitals while the Afghan forces clearly seem to be in a retreat.
This certainly raises questions not only on the US policy on Afghanistan, but the way the Afghan army was raised as a professional army, and above all, the increased sufferings of the Afghan people to date.
But Zunaira, despite all the diplomatic efforts, the constant rise in violence needs an immediate and meaningful intervention by all the relevant stakeholders.
And to understand, Jawad, this Afghan conundrum, we are joined by Mr. Najibullah Azad, former spokesperson for Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. Thank you so much, Mr. Azad, for joining us. We have an intelligence report in front of us, a US intelligence report that says that it is only a matter of 90 days that Taliban could take over Kabul. Do you agree to that? Do you see the ground reality close to this?
Well, unfortunately, the fight in Afghanistan is at its height, and the intelligence report probably a month ago they predicted a year, but now they're predicting 3 to 6 months. Well, like I told you before, the fight is at its height, and Taliban have they have taken over 10 provinces so far. But according to some reports, the international community themselves will not let Taliban to take over Kabul. But the ground reality is, well, they're making the developments very fast.
Right.
But if we see today to the international community, I don't think so they will let Taliban to take over Kabul.
Okay, Mr. Azad, do you think that such violence will increase in the coming days, or there are chances, as you just mentioned, that the international community or the international forces won't allow the Taliban to take over, particularly when we talk about the capital, Kabul?
Well, if you remember when they're talking about Afghanistan, specifically when the United States were talking about Afghanistan, they always mentioned the capital, Kabul, and they always emphasized that they will not let the Taliban to take over Kabul, but of course they have taken over other provinces. So the violence is at its height, and unfortunately more than 300,000 families became IDPs in the last month. So if the international community, of course, they have started talking in Doha and Troika Plus. In the regional powers in the United States, they're talking about Afghan government and what's going on in here. And of course, the Congress just this morning they started thinking of resending the forces to Afghanistan or resending the American forces to Afghanistan. So I don't think any increase in the violence in the future days. If the international community let the entire situation as it is, then of course the situation will be worse than what we see today.
Well, that is exactly my point. We are all witnessing that whatever violence is there on part of Taliban, but at the same time, the aerial bombardment by the US forces, although they say that is to help the Afghan government, but you know, you're back to the war. There is violence, facing violence. Is that the conclusion?
Well, I think it's been 3 days only. Just 3 days ago, some international media outlets, they say that the B-25 of the United States aircraft will bomb, or they got the order of Joe Biden. But I don't think so. There was no bombing of the B-52. So if they do so, of course, there will be violence, but the violence that is increasing every day from Taliban will be decreased, because the way they're fighting, the guerrilla fighting, and they're getting into people's houses, villages, and that makes the situation even worse. But there is a diplomatic discussion in Doha, and on the other way, if the United States forces or the government try to warn Taliban, I don't think Taliban will go as faster as they're doing now, and they will start moving back just because of the air strikes of the United States. If the United States decides to do the air strikes, there will be a bigger violence. But in that case, I don't see Taliban will go to that situation. They will step back.
So, I mean, how do you think, I mean, who had been responsible for this recent surge in violence in Afghanistan? Taliban became a little angered after they said that the US was intervening with this air support, and that fact has been highlighted, well, in fact, said by President Joe Biden as well, that they will continue to support the Afghan National Forces with the air support in the coming days. So, I mean, does it make any sense that it's also not the violation of the Doha peace deal?
Well, the Doha peace deal was violated since day one. The Doha peace deal was made between the United States and Taliban. The Afghan government was not a part. And then the deal was that the Taliban will not attack Americans, and also they will not attack the provincial cities, the Sanders, but they have done so far. The 10 provinces they have taken over are the provinces, including the districts and the capitals, and they have already violated the deal. So if one side is violating the deal, and United States will go to violate the deal as well. If they're going to go for the airstrike, the deal will be violated, and which has already been violated. And who is responsible for this? I'll think. I believe that it's not an Afghan war. It's not a war between Taliban and Afghanistan. It's an international war between the regional powers and the United States. There's a political, military, and financial or economical competition between them. The regional connectivity thing in here, and they've been talking for 3 years. The Troika Plus, all that stuff. Unless the international community or the international powers like United States with the regional powers, they don't reach to an agreement based on their interest, the Afghan issue between Taliban or Afghan government in a intra-Afghan discussion will not be resolved. So of course the deal was that day one it didn't have any legitimacy. A superpower comes to sign a deal with a fraction without the government that or the country or a state which is
you made a very fine point here. You just made a very fine point here, and I must want to raise further questions on that. If Afghanistan is becoming hub of regional competitors and with competitors who are having different competing interests, do you think there is ever going to be the real peace in Afghanistan?
I don't see that in at least in a decade, the real peace, the way the peace is defined. No, but at least the violence we've been witnessing, the violence that people are suffering, and a couple hundred thousand people are they are made to leave their houses. They're dying or being killed every day. That could be decreased, but the typical definition of peace I don't see in a decade, because in the past 2 decades, international communities were here, regional powers were here. They were competing with each other. A government structure was made in Afghanistan, and then the Taliban were weakened a decade ago, and the scenario is 180 degrees different today. So that peace you're talking about, which is defined by the international community, conventions and laws, political science, and all that stuff, I don't see that in a decade.
All right. And do you think there was any kind of policy in place? Like, was the government ready for the withdrawal? Was there ever a post-withdrawal strategy lined out by Afghan government? Were they ready?
Well, see, the withdrawal is it wasn't in Afghan government's hand, and the decision was made rapidly before time. Afghan government in the United States, they had a deal or agreement, what we call it the BSA or bilateral security agreement, and they, according to that agreement and according to the agreement with the NATO alliance so far, the international forces had to be here for at least two more years, but they just decided to pull out their troops. So Afghan government was not expecting this, and while they were not expecting this,
Afghan government was not expecting this. Does this mean that it was decided by US unilaterally, without consultation with the Afghan government?
Well, honestly speaking, of course, yes, because there were two agreements between the Afghan government, the United States, and NATO alliances, and there was a strategy of 2017 of the Trump administration for Afghanistan and South Asia. They're violated, nothing is implemented, so the Afghan government was mostly relying on the international community, and when the decision was made by one side, a single decision maker, so the Afghan government was not expecting, and they neither had any strategy or plan to fill those gaps after the international community or international forces leave. So yeah, the withdrawal was not made in cooperation with the Afghan government.
So Mr. Azad, this very attitude of the US towards the Afghan government, which it considered legitimate, so don't you think this very attitude makes that legitimacy of the Afghan government questionable?
According to the Afghan constitution, the Afghan government has its legitimacy. There are three branches of the government: the executive, the judiciary, and the legislation. And of course, the government is elected. Doesn't matter how many votes Ghani won in 2019 plus. So the Afghan government has diplomatic relation with most part of the world. We have embassies in the foreign countries, and we have their embassies in here. There are conventions, the UN conventions that Afghanistan government or Afghan state is the member of those conventions. So in that sense, no, there's no question on the legitimacy, but the mutual interest. Based on the mutual interest, it was a war against terrorism. It wasn't an Afghan war. The deal in 2001 in Bonn Conference, and after that, there were deals made with international communities. Agreements were signed in Brussels and everywhere, including London. So those deals were to fight against terrorism, not to fund or to support the Afghan government to fight the civil war. So based on that, fighting against or war against terrorism, it was a mutual understanding, mutual interest. But at the end of the day, the United States or international community, they guaranteed their interest and left Afghanistan with whatever it was or wherever it was. So the legitimacy at all is not under question, but the deal or the agreements that were made were violated by one side.
Do you think you need help from international community? And if yes, what kind of help? How can you secure some level or some degree of peace in Afghanistan? It can't go on like this, of course.
Well, in 21st century, not only Afghanistan, many countries depend on each other. There are arguments between countries financially, economically, and politically. Of course, military as well. And a situation that Afghanistan has been fighting a war against terrorism. It is not an Afghan war. So if Afghanistan is fighting a war against terrorism, so that means Afghanistan is fighting for the region and for the entire world. So in that case, Afghanistan needs support. Afghanistan needs political support, economical support, of course, the military support.
And Azad, with 20 years of support, the terrorism has still not gone.
And there has been a lot of financial support as well, Mr. Azad. And around $2 trillion were pumped in to Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. And there have been allegations of corrupt practices on the previous governments as well as the Ashraf Ghani's government. How do you see that?
Well, nobody can close their eyes on what's happening in here. Corruption, of course, there has been corruption for the last 2 decades, especially for the last 5-6 years. Unfortunately, Afghanistan has been one of those top countries in the world of corrupt government systems. There is no doubt, and that is also because since the day one, when international communities were here, the provinces were divided. They call it PRT, Provincial Rehabilitation Team. The international community were managing everything, and they were spending and they were just throwing money to people the way they wanted. One thing, which is the root of all corruption in here. Secondly, the Afghan government or the state we see today started from zero. We didn't have anything in 2001. Right after the regime, the Taliban regime, when it was collapsed, everything started from zero. The infrastructure, development, military, institutions, schools, universities. So all that stuff within 20 years, 2 decades for a nation building, for state building is a very limited and very short time.
And Biden administration clearly says that we did not go there for nation building. That's a separate debate. Last question, sir. Do you believe that a change of army chief would make a difference?
I don't think so, because when there is no concrete strategy, when there is no mutual understanding and benefits the Afghan government and international community here, only some replacement in any stage, or if it's in defense and security institutions or in civil institutions, it doesn't make any difference.
All right. I said it was the last question, but Jawad asks more.
Mr. Azad, the Interior Minister of Afghanistan said in an interview with an international media outlet that they are arming the local people to fight the Taliban. So does it depict an ensuing civil war?
Well, I see that one of the biggest mistake, because if you invest on locals to fight against Taliban, it doesn't make any sense and it doesn't make any difference. While you have to rely and you have to invest on your security and defense institutions. The civil war, I don't think so, because the warlords we have today, they already fought in 90s against Taliban, and meanwhile. We got a security and defense institutions in here, and they will not let you to go to that situation. Those are some figures. They believe that they can make any changes or guarantee their own interest, personal interest. I don't think that will lead them to a civil war, because people will not go with them. Some very few numbers of locals fighting against Taliban will not lead the entire thing to a civil war. But if the situation, the way the war or fight is going on between the Afghan security forces and Taliban, that could lead to a worsened situation if the international community does not take an action.
So, Mr. Azad, you are of the view that not a many number of people are going to be joining whatever the government is going to provide them. But the Interior Minister has given the numbers. I mean, he says that the Afghan people completely support the government and the actions that it is going to take against the Taliban, which are three-phased. So does this particular claim by the Interior Minister holds water?
Well, the Afghan people, no doubt, they do support the government. They do not support individuals, but the government, which is called democratic structure of the government. They do support, but making this or leading this entire thing to a civil war, I don't think so, because people are frustrated of all that war. And meanwhile, the proxy war can never be calculated by the Afghans, by the international community. Well, there are people fighting against Taliban. There are Taliban fighting against people in the Afghan government who do not even know what the proxy war is or what the conspiracy theories are implemented in here. But just specifically pointing to the civil war, I don't think so, because today is different than 90s. In 90s, those jihadist groups were mainly supported by Pakistan, came to Afghanistan. They started fighting over the power, and there was no opportunity for others. But during these 2 decades, all the regional powers, they have played their role in here. They try to support proxy wars, and they try to threaten each other's, the regional powers' interest. So if in that scenario we go to a civil war, it won't be a civil war in here only. It will be a bigger threat for the region and for the international community, which I don't think so. The international community will let
You're talking about the spillover effect. I totally endorse that, but are these news of other proxies getting into Afghanistan, like ISIS and other groups integrating against or in alliance with Taliban, is this true?
Well, see, when there's a platform, when a war-torn country like Afghanistan has been changed into a war zone or a hub, then any activities, any terrorism activities could be practiced there. Of course, IS and Al-Qaeda and Turkmenistan, Eastern Turkmenistan movement, which is fighting in China, and of course, groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish Mohammadi, they will have a platform in here. During a war, when there is a chaos, you can expect anything. So I do believe they still have links, they still have contacts.
So how come all the banned organizations that you're talking about, like Jaish-e-Mohammed or Lashkar-e-Taiba, these are the banned outfits? Why are they allowed to harbor and get together or whatever they are doing in Afghanistan? How come they are allowed? Who is giving them the open hallway to do whatever they want?
Well, see, there were many groups in the world, even IS, even Al-Qaeda, even Taliban for some years ago. They were blacklisted by the Security Council of the United Nations, but they had been fighting, and they had safe havens in Pakistan. You know, there are groups, they were provided safe havens in Pakistan. Even the Pakistani ex-leaders in the past, including Pervez Musharraf and the current Interior Minister, he said that their families are there, their dead bodies are brought in here. So all this proxy war, and especially when safe havens are provided across the Durand line, then there are others to support them as well and provide them a platform to fight for
I beg to differ. I must say this, that this narrative of Pakistan providing the safe havens, it has been sold for a very long time. And the very fact that now Pakistan is trying to stay away from what is happening in Taliban is also not acceptable to international community, because they think we have the leverage to tell the Taliban whatever we want to tell. On the ground, we could tell them to go to the negotiating table. They did that, but now when they are in the position of strength, why would they listen to us?
Well, they're in a position in power for 3 months only, and you know, policies are not changing in 3 months. If we go back 3 months before, Taliban were not in a position they are today, and today, you see, just 3 days ago,
it is said that it was long expected that they are concluding, they are harboring the drug money, all the militias and all the ammunition that the US Army was leaving there. They were ready for it. And they are trained personnel. They have fought with the US. They don't need Pakistan for anything else now. Now they are at a position of strength. I think it was the Trump administration's announcement of withdrawal that they started to gain momentum. It is not a matter of 3 months only.
No, the announcement is a different thing. Of course, morally, psychologically, they got strong right after the announcement the Trump administration made that they will withdraw from Afghanistan. That is a psychological or a moral power. But the platform or the safe havens provided places very recognized. And this is not me or Afghans or international community blaming. This is the Pakistani leaders, they say.
So, Mr. Azad, what about the safe havens which are being provided to the Tehrik-e-Taliban, the banned Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan over there across the Durand line in Afghanistan? And they had been TTP, and that is the concern which had been raised repeatedly by the Pakistani authorities.
They have 62 bases in Afghanistan.
And we've seen that Pakistan finally decided to go for the border fencing in order to regulate that infiltration that was happening from the other side of the border. And then in 2014, we saw such a heinous terrorist act that killed over 140 innocent children.
School-going children.
Yeah. And TTP was clearly involved in that. What about those safe havens? Why nobody talks about those, which are on the Afghan soil, and Afghan soil being used against Pakistan?
Well, I don't know why nobody talks about it, but I talk about it. See, the TTP, if they were here in Kunar, many TTP's leaders were headed in Kunar province, and two were arrested in Logar in 2013 and were handed over to Pakistani government. But yet, there was nothing rallies against Pakistan by TTPs in Afghanistan. They never had holding the Afghan passports, traveling. They never had any conferences. They never had any selection or election thing like they have in Peshawar and Akora, Khatak and in Quetta. You see, just 3 days ago in Peshawar, they were fundraising for Taliban. And the Pakistani political parties, Islamic political parties like Maulana Fazl Rahman Party, they are openly supporting the Afghan Taliban. But you don't see anything happening like that in Afghanistan.
Well, I think there is a misconception of parties leaning towards the religion, and there is a difference between supporting the Taliban.
Having a very solid proof of them supporting them.
Yeah, so they are a religious party, but they don't support Taliban. And with this, I would like to thank you so much for your time.
Mr. Najibullah Azad, former spokesperson for the Afghan Presidential Palace, thank you very much for your time at Indus News. We really appreciate that. It's the time for a short break, and after we return from that break, we'll be joined by Pakistan's National Security Advisor, Dr. Moheed Yousuf, to what he has to say. For that, stay tuned to Indus Afghan Special.
Welcome back once again to this special Afghan debate on Indus. We were all talking to Najibullah Azad, who was talking about his perspective from Afghan point of view on the current situation in the region and Afghanistan in particular. Now we are joined by Moheed Yousuf, National Security Advisor. It's a pleasure having you, Moheed, and I'll come straight to the question. You do have a comprehensive experience of knowing how and what shapes the U.S. policies. What do you think is the current crisis is the outcome of? Is it a flawed U.S. policy on Afghanistan or something else?
You know, I wouldn't say U.S. or... look, I think that the basic makeup of this idea of coming into another country and then trying to redo the country through use of force. You know, I speak as a scholar here, frankly, although I resist that temptation these days, but it hasn't worked anywhere in the world. The nation-building project really, I think, at the end of the day was an afterthought. And I never saw how it was coming together when the region wasn't on board. Frankly, a number of those who we called statesmen after 9/11 in Afghanistan were really warlords and militia leaders. And so, yes, I think there was something wrong in the way this whole campaign was structured. The best possible outcome would have been if the US agreed to a political settlement after 2002 when the Taliban were you know, down and out. But this happens in counterinsurgencies. You want to maximize your position of strength, you go for total victory. Absolutely. And most of the times the outcome goes against you, and that's exactly what we've seen.
Okay, Mr. Yousuf, Obama administration also wanted to pull out of Afghanistan, but it didn't work then. What, in your opinion, has finally made the US evacuate Afghanistan completely?
Well, I think President Biden has said it himself, right? I mean, I think in his statement, he's publicly said that he thought that you could stay there for another God knows how many years and still the outcome would be the same. So I think he's basically just decided there was no point continuing because no positive outcome from the US perspective was likely to come out of this, and he wanted to, I think he's basically prioritized his troops over everything else. And so, you know, that's in his own words, he just didn't see the point of staying. The problem is we'd always talked about responsible withdrawal, which meant political settlement and withdrawal in tandem with that. Here we've got withdrawal and no political settlement, and that's really taken away everybody's leverage on what happens in the battlefield. And unfortunately, we are seeing that there is now increasing violence, and so that probably was not factored in or not cared about.
Do you think this partisan support of US towards Afghan government after the withdrawal is legitimate?
I mean, legitimacy is frankly not the real question. The real issue is we have to get to a political settlement. If we don't get to a political settlement, Afghanistan hurts, Pakistan hurts terribly, and the entire region. And at the end of the day, the US interests as well, because then there are global terrorist groups who still exist in Afghanistan or can really create sanctuary for themselves if there is a vacuum. So the real issue right now is that all efforts have to be made, must be made to get to a political settlement. Pakistan is doing whatever it can, but the US needs to continue its lead in terms of the political settlement process and also convince the Ashraf Ghani government that it must compromise given the ground situation. It can't just hunker down and pretend that there isn't 60–70% of the territory that's no longer in Kabul's control. And so everybody has to compromise. That's our message. That's what we are focused on.
Now, Mr. Yousuf, while Pakistan had some sort of leverage over Taliban, it did play a role to bring them to peace talks. But while they are getting territorial control, do you think they would listen to Pakistan as pressure is mounting from the US also?
Look, it's just logical. If you have fought a war for 20 years, you feel that you've defeated a superpower, you're going to think you can make it to the end just by using military force. Their initial campaigns have been very successful. We're seeing, every day there's a capital city district falling. If that is true, I don't know what leverage anybody can use. Because what are you going to tell them? You're going to tell them, stop your military action, come to the table and talk. And then on the other side, the actor that is to talk is saying, oh, I'm the elected president, just come and become part of my government. It's not going to happen that way. Everybody has to think out of the box, find a compromise, and put a mechanism together which reflects ground realities, also keeps a system going in Afghanistan that is politically viable in terms of delivering governance.
Well, Moheed, while the regional powers like China and Russia are engaging with Taliban, talking to them, why is there a discontent in Washington when it comes to Pakistan?
This is I don't know how to put it. Look, 20 years down the line, you've got an Afghan government that no major political Afghan actor seems to accept as their representative. You've got stories coming out of the West on how millions and billions and trillions of dollars were put into Afghanistan and have all come to naught. Answer a question for me. Why isn't the Afghan army fighting? All that money we heard for years and years, we put up a first-class kind of army and security force in Afghanistan. They're well-equipped, well-trained. They're not fighting because they don't believe in the system. They don't see the government representing people. People perhaps do not support them. Whatever the reason may be, what we are seeing is after 20 years, it's been a colossal failure. Now, I'm not saying X's fault or Y's fault or Z's fault. That's not the point. The point is, how can you now with a straight face try and use Pakistan as a scapegoat and blame Pakistan for what is happening? Is Pakistan telling the ANA not to fight? Has Pakistan told the Afghan elite to be so corrupt that they are billionaires? Dubai, one of the largest investments by diaspora is Afghans, and look at what the reality is about the Afghan people. We stand for and by the Afghan people. And if anybody is coming in the way of the peace process, that's very unfortunate. And some of those in Afghanistan who claim to be talking for Afghan people really have now become a major problem. Look at the areas that the Taliban have captured. Western Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan, hundreds of miles away from the Pakistani border. How can Pakistan have anything to do with that? So I think it's really now unfortunate. Dated narratives are continuing. It's convenient to use Pakistan as a scapegoat. Just yesterday, we have publicly put out data-driven analysis on how social media trends, bots, artificial trends from India and Afghanistan are creating this aura of, oh, it's Pakistan's fault, sanction Pakistan. It's all made up. Pakistan is the victim. For 40 years, we've now suffered because of a war next door that had nothing to do with us in terms of its start or its origins. Pakistan has housed millions of Afghan refugees. Now, if anybody blames Pakistan, that's really insulting the Pakistani people.
Mr. Yousuf, Pakistan has supported a U.S. war on terror and has paid a very heavy price. Do you think we can sustain siding with the U.S. again after 20 years? Or is there any possibility that this step, siding with the U.S., could offend the Taliban?
I think the basic answer to your question is we side with peace in Afghanistan. Peace and peace attained through a political negotiation is non-negotiable for Pakistan, because we are going to hurt if there is spillover, and spillover will come if there's protracted conflict. So the bottom line is, support this or support that is one thing. We need a political settlement, so we are supporting a peace process, facilitating and trying our level best.
Who were you actually referring to when you said in a statement that no violence will be tolerated in Afghanistan?
No, I think the comment I would have made would be that Pakistan does not stand for any forceful takeover of Afghanistan. And yes, we don't stand for that, because we are saying any durable solution has to be inclusive and it has to be a political settlement. That's what we're talking about. So any forceful takeover will actually not get there. And also, to get to a forceful takeover, any side, for any side, there's going to be months of protracted conflict, and that for Pakistan is unacceptable, because the spillover again is going to come to Pakistan if it gets to that point.
So what, in your opinion, is the way out of the current situation in Afghanistan?
For everybody with any leverage or contact to convince the Afghan government, the Taliban and all other Afghan political actors to get in one room, draw the parameters. What are the parameters? No forceful takeover. Everybody has to compromise. Violence has to come down as that happens. Some kind of constitutional arrangement, some kind of agreement on rights in the Afghan context. Within those parameters, everybody's got to convince them to sit in one room, decide what political future they want for their country, and everybody must respect that.
And very briefly, in precise words, what is Pakistan's current policy on Afghanistan?
Focus on peace, peace, and peace in Afghanistan, and convince others and do whatever we can to get there.
Mr. Yousuf, last but not the least, where do you see us standing when it comes to current Pak-US relationship?
You know, a lot has been said about it. I actually think the relationship is actually moving in the right direction. We've got a structured dialogue process led by the two NSAs. That was the reason for my visit. We are moving forward in multiple sectors. On Afghanistan, both agree peace is necessary, both agree political settlement is the only way out. On the methodology, there can be differences, and sort of we're working on that. Yes, there is a lingering mistrust in this relationship because of the past, but that's our point again and again. Look to the present and future. It is not always seamless, but we are moving in the right direction. There's a positive conversation between the NSAs on the military side, and so the process is moving. We are not into optics, we're talking substance, and that's why you don't hear much about it, but I think there are substantive things that are happening.
Dr. Moheed Yousuf, Pakistan's National Security Advisor, thank you very much for your time at Indus News. We really appreciate that. We've got the Pakistan's perspective regarding the situation that is unfolding in Afghanistan. And to talk more about this, we are now joined by Mr. Micheal Kugelman. He's the Deputy Director and the Senior Associate at the Wilson Center. He's joining us from Washington. Mr. Kugelman, thank you very much for your time at Indus News. So first of all, looking at the trajectory of the U.S. foreign policy on the countries like Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now Afghanistan, do you think there is an issue with the policy itself or its implementation?
Well, I think that one could say that the U.S. Has been very good at starting wars, but has really failed to end them in a safe and responsible way. I mean, I think that's quite clear. The U.S. went into Afghanistan in 2001 and achieved its initial objectives fairly quickly in terms of degrading the Al-Qaeda sanctuary and then removing the Taliban from government. But then I think that in the years that followed, the successive U.S. governments really struggled to articulate a clear strategy for why U.S. forces were still there in Afghanistan fighting this war. And now President Biden has decided to withdraw. And, the withdrawal, I think, is going very well from the perspective of the U.S. government in the sense that it's happening ahead of schedule and U.S. troops are not getting shot at, which was really the major objective for the U.S. But clearly, we see the situation on the ground right now, and it could not be any worse. And we have the U.S. intensifying or expediting its withdrawal at a moment when the Taliban is waging an unprecedented offensive. And the administration claims that it's leaving for good and it won't come back, which is probably true. But I think that we can look to the possibility of the U.S. trying to build up enough of a capacity for potential counterterrorism activities in Afghanistan that would target Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So yes, the U.S. is leaving, but that doesn't mean that that we're going to necessarily see the end of U.S. military activities in Afghanistan, even after the withdrawal.
Well, Micheal, is it possible that despite your exit, US's exit from Afghanistan, your continued partisan support to Afghan government is the reason behind Taliban offensive?
Well, there are plenty of reasons for the Taliban offensive, and I think it's important to underscore that this offensive did not come out of nowhere. I think it's been happening at a speed that's very surprising and very troubling. But we've seen in recent years the Taliban has basically been preparing the grounds for this major offensive. It had seized a lot of rural territory in recent years, giving it footholds to be able to eventually launch offensives in cities. It's been able to amass a huge number of heavy weapons because it sees so much of weaponry from Afghan forces and probably from NATO forces as well to some extent. And it's been able to make a lot of money through various illicit industries, including drugs. So I think that once Biden announced his decision to withdraw, it was just a matter of time before the Taliban would essentially set into motion these plans that had presumably made quite some time ago to try to stage offensives into cities, areas that the Taliban has largely stayed out of in terms of offensives in previous years. So a lot of reasons that explain what's going on, but I think the main point here is that this is not sudden. It didn't come out of nowhere because the Taliban had been getting increasingly stronger and more potent over the last few years.
So, Mr. Kugelman, what were you expecting would happen in Afghanistan once the U.S. leaves?
Well, I figured it was inevitable that the violence would increase and that the Taliban would mount its offensives. And I had warned that. I had been one of those analysts in Washington that had supported the idea of a U.S. troop withdrawal because I felt that the U.S. had done all it could after all these years. So I knew that there was going to be violence. What has been a bit surprising is the degree to which Afghan forces have simply been completely unprepared to respond to these offenses. And I think that there could be a level of underplaying the degree of struggles that the Afghan security forces have had, and also the poor leadership coming from the Afghan government, the inability to ensure that Afghan troops have the equipment and everything that they need, because there's major morale problems with the Afghan security forces. And I think that on many levels, what we've seen play out in these provincial capitals seized in Afghanistan in recent days, it's as much Afghan forces essentially losing as much as it is the Taliban winning, in the sense that so many of these offensives have happened with little resistance from Afghan security forces, and some Afghan forces have surrendered as well. So I think that we all knew, I mean, any casual observer would have figured that the Taliban would ramp up the violence and the offensives after the announcement to withdraw and after the U.S. withdrawal. But I think that the speed with which it's happened has been a bit surprising, and I think that that's in part because of just not completely acknowledging how challenged the Afghan security forces are and how much they've struggled to be in a position to push back against the Taliban.
At the moment, are there any negotiations going on behind closed doors with Taliban?
Well, I hope so, though I think it's unlikely. I mean, there have been, the Taliban has continued to have meetings with various players and stakeholders in recent days, but I think that we can assume that, at least for the immediate term, the Doha process, the intra-Afghan dialogue, it's dead in the water. It certainly is not dead, but it's just in a bad spot right now. The negotiating environment is simply not healthy at all. I think that the Afghan government would be very fearful of entering back into serious negotiations because it fears that the Taliban would demand huge concessions and perhaps even demand a surrender from the Afghan military. It has the upper hand in negotiations. It can make those types of demands. So I think that there's not really an interest right now. I think that until and unless the Afghan security forces are able to put the Taliban back on the back foot and regain some of the momentum it's lost to the Taliban, unless those things happen, I don't think we're going to see better prospects for the intra-Afghan dialogue.
So Jawad, this concludes today's debate.
Of course, and with this we come to the end of the first part of this discussion. Tomorrow, when we come back, we will resume this debate on Afghanistan with some new guests. For that, stay tuned to Indus News at the same time.
See you then.